In a moment that left the monarchy rattled and the public stunned, Prince William and Princess Anne stepped forward together, united, stern and unwavering. What they announced would send shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. Camilla's role, long protected and politically untouchable, was now on the chopping block. But why now? And what hidden events forced this joint move? What followed was a chain reaction that would shatter royal protocols and reveal deep-seated betrayal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with a subtle ripple, not a storm. A quiet tension had been building between the younger and older factions of the monarchy, but no one expected a unified front between two of its most stoic figures. When William and Anne appeared side by side at the press podium without warning, without the king, the world knew something seismic was unfolding. Their joint statement was short but heavy, carefully worded yet laced with undeniable finality. Camilla's role was to be reassessed and redefined, terms never before uttered publicly in regard to the Queen Consort. The message was clear: a shift had occurred, and the old lines of loyalty had been redrawn. Sources inside the palace revealed the language wasn't spontaneous. It had been in the works for weeks. Every glance between William and Anne, every calculated pause, was the result of meticulous planning. Behind the scenes, royal aides scrambled to understand how such a significant announcement had bypassed the usual royal channels. Even Charles, the king himself, appeared to have been informed just minutes before the public, leading to an eerie silence from his quarters. But the most telling sign of all came not from words but absence. Camilla, usually quick to command the narrative, disappeared from all palace activity. Her office went dark. Her staff issued no comment. Her name, once everywhere, vanished in a whisper. Yet while the public grappled with the gravity of the announcement, murmurs of a deeper cause began to surface. Insiders whispered about a document, an old letter from the late Queen Elizabeth, locked away for years, now reportedly unearthed by Anne during a private archive review. That letter, they said, contained words that challenged the foundation of Camilla's position and questioned the trajectory of the monarchy's future. Though the palace refused to confirm its existence, the timing was too precise, too calculated. And with William by her side, Anne had chosen not to ignore it. Instead, she had chosen to act. The joint appearance wasn't a rebellion, it was a reclamation, a message to the public, to the palace, and perhaps even to the king himself that loyalty to legacy would not be compromised for comfort, that the values of the crown were bigger than any one individual, no matter how high their title reached. It was a moment that cracked open the veil of unity the monarchy had so desperately tried to maintain, revealing the raw divisions that had long festered beneath. And as the nation watched with bated breath, one question echoed louder than the rest: what now? But what led to this dramatic collapse of trust? To understand that, we must journey back into the shadows of whispered oaths, secret alliances, and a brewing storm within royal walls. For years they moved in separate orbits. William, the dutiful heir; Anne, the unyielding royal stalwart. But behind palace doors a bond was quietly forming. One forged not in love, but in loyalty to a legacy they believed was under threat. While Camilla expanded her influence, William and Anne were quietly laying the groundwork for resistance. It didn't begin with grand gestures. It began with glances across long tables, late-night messages that avoided official channels, and fleeting moments during public duties when words couldn't be spoken but intent was unmistakably shared. William, increasingly frustrated by the shifting balance of influence within the family, had begun to see a pattern. Camilla wasn't just occupying ceremonial space. She was maneuvering strategically, subtly tightening her grip on key decisions, from royal patronages to press strategies. Anne, always the observer, had seen it long before anyone else. And while she had remained silent out of loyalty to her brother, even she had begun to question whether silence was still a virtue. The moment that changed everything came tucked within an innocuous folder, a document misfiled or perhaps hidden, no one knows for certain, but it was Anne who found it deep within Queen Elizabeth's private archive at Windsor. It wasn't just any letter, it was a personal, handwritten note from the late Queen, dated months before her passing, expressing quiet concern about the trajectory of the monarchy. It mentioned Catherine, referred to her as the people's cornerstone, and warned that ambition cloaked in loyalty must never compromise the throne. The message wasn't directed at anyone by name, but both Anne and William knew exactly who it pointed to, and in that moment, the silent alliance was born not out of revenge but out of duty. Meetings began quietly, no security detail, no formal record. At remote estates and trusted corners of the palace, William and Anne spoke openly. He shared his growing concern over being excluded from decisions that directly impacted his future reign. Anne, too, had noticed the change certain family charities redirected, ceremonial protocols reshuffled, and invitations that once would have included Catherine mysteriously omitted. The machinery of influence was shifting, and it wasn't Charles pulling the levers, it was Camilla. Anne's words to William were stark. If we wait too long, the damage will be irreversible. What emerged from those meetings wasn't a plot, it was a plan. Not to dethrone Camilla, but to curtail the silent power she had amassed. They agreed the public would never accept an outright removal, but what they could do was expose the imbalance, create pressure, and reposition Catherine not just as a supportive spouse, but as the legitimate future of the monarchy. It was subtle, calculated, and slow-moving. But it was working. Until something or someone forced their hand. And just when they thought they still had time, a betrayal from within pushed their silent pact into public action. She was groomed to be queen, but what if the palace didn't want her to be? Catherine, admired by millions, was reportedly the target of a quiet but deliberate campaign. And at the center of it, whispers led straight to Camilla. For William, this wasn't just politics, it was personal, at first. The changes were subtle enough to dismiss. A trusted aide reassigned, a long-standing communications advisor suddenly reporting to a different office. Invitations to private strategy briefings that once carried Catherine's name now arriving without it. The shifts were quiet, almost polite, but they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Staff who had built their careers around loyalty to the future queen began gravitating toward Camilla's expanding circle, drawn by influence, proximity, and the promise of longevity under the current king. The palace ecosystem was adjusting itself in real time, and Catherine was being pushed to the margins. Then came the memos. Internal notes that should never have left secured desks somehow surfaced in whispers among senior aides. They outlined upcoming engagements, policy discussions, and charitable realignments. Catherine's involvement, once central, was reduced to ceremonial appearances. Strategy meetings about the monarchy's global image excluded her entirely. The language was clinical, almost bureaucratic, but the message was devastating. She was being repositioned as symbolic rather than substantive. When William saw the documents, the weight of it hit him all at once. This wasn't oversight, it was orchestration. Anne did not confront easily, but when she did, it was direct and unflinching. In a private exchange that sources say crackled with tension, she accused Camilla of undermining the Princess of Wales through calculated influence. Camilla reportedly denied everything, dismissing concerns as paranoia and insisting that adjustments were part of modernization. But Anne saw through it. She had lived long enough in palace politics to recognize a power shift when it was unfolding, and this one was deliberate. For William, the breaking point came during a quiet conversation with a senior aide he had trusted for years. His voice, usually measured, reportedly trembled with restrained anger. "She's being erased from within," he confessed, not by public scandal or personal failing, but by 1,000 quiet exclusions that would eventually make her role ceremonial and nothing more. And as media outlets began publishing carefully planted narratives describing Catherine as fragile and overwhelmed, the emotional toll deepened. The image of strength she had cultivated was being chipped away, replaced with doubt. The campaign was no longer contained within palace walls, it had spilled into public perception. The turning point arrived in a private meeting between Catherine and Anne, away from official residences and prying ears. It was not a meeting of complaint, but of clarity. Catherine, composed yet visibly wounded, admitted she felt the ground shifting beneath her. Anne listened, then spoke with a resolve that cut through uncertainty. "The monarchy," she said, could survive scandal, but it could not survive internal corrosion. That conversation solidified something irreversible. This was no longer about rivalry, it was about safeguarding the future. But the full extent of the betrayal wouldn't become clear until one woman broke royal protocol and revealed a hidden document meant to stay buried, locked away in a sealed box. A document signed in Queen Elizabeth's unmistakable hand was never meant for public eyes, but when it surfaced, it altered the future of the monarchy. In it, a line that shattered Camilla's carefully built image and gave William and Anne the legal leverage they needed. The discovery came not from accident, but from quiet determination. Anne, digging through the late Queen's personal archive during what was believed to be a routine estate review, came across a folder marked only with the sovereign's cipher. Tucked inside was a rarely discussed but legally valid addendum to the official succession documents. It was dated, signed, and unmistakably authentic. But what mattered most wasn't the signature, it was the content. The document outlined specific ceremonial and advisory limitations for the Queen consort, a framework the late Queen believed necessary to preserve constitutional clarity and emotional continuity with the public. It named no one directly, yet its intentions were razor-sharp. For all her warmth in public, Queen Elizabeth had never fully endorsed Camilla's expanded role, and in that private clause, she had drawn an invisible boundary, one that had been quietly ignored. According to sources close to the archive staff, the document was known only to a handful of trusted advisors, yet after the Queen's passing, it had been discreetly buried under layers of bureaucracy. Charles's inner circle had allegedly deemed it non-binding, interpreting it as an outdated expression of sentiment rather than enforceable directive. But William and Anne saw it differently. The clause had teeth. It tied the title of Queen Consort to a strict set of non-negotiable values: dignity, impartiality, and above all, public trust. If those values were compromised, the Crown had the right to reassess the consort's visibility and influence. It wasn't just symbolic, it was a legal line in the sand. When Anne confronted William with the revelation, his reaction was immediate and visceral. For months, they had both felt the erosion of tradition, the slow twisting of legacy into something unrecognizable. Now they had proof written and sealed that their concerns weren't paranoia, they were justified. Anne, usually restrained, reportedly slammed the file shut and muttered, "She's undone Mother's final words." The betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. It meant someone had made the conscious choice to override the Queen's final safeguard, and that someone was close to the throne. William knew the risks. Going public with the document would be seen as a declaration of war not just against Camilla but against the establishment his own father led. But the cost of silence had already grown too great. The image of Catherine sidelined, the monarchy reshaped without its rightful anchor, the public left in the dark. It was no longer tolerable. In a private meeting with Anne and two legal advisors, William made the call. We go public or we lose everything. That decision would set everything else into motion, because secrets, once unearthed, rarely stay silent. Armed with the truth, William and Anne faced a dangerous crossroads, but to proceed they would have to confront the one man holding Camilla's fate in his hands. He loved them both, his wife and his son. But as king, Charles faced a nightmare decision. Behind the palace walls he was breaking, torn between the legacy of a mother he revered and the loyalty to a wife he defended. Charles's silence was no longer neutrality, it was complicity. The revelations surrounding Queen Elizabeth's private clause had shaken more than just public perception, it had ripped through the core of royal command. William and Anne now held the one thing the palace feared most, written proof of intent, and with it came demands for realignment. But Charles, the man now wearing the crown, could barely speak the words needed. According to palace sources, he delayed meetings, dodged internal calls, and refused to sign any document that would officially acknowledge the clause's authority. His justification? The Queen's note, though personal, was not constitutional. But to those watching closely, it wasn't legal caution, it was fear. Fear of what Camilla might say. Fear of unraveling the very structure he had spent decades building around her. Behind closed doors, the situation grew volatile. William, no longer the cautious heir, reportedly confronted his father in the royal study with frustration boiling over. Witnesses described raised voices, audible down the corridor. William accused Charles of rewriting the crown's future with silence. The king, visibly shaken, had no defense. It wasn't that he didn't understand the damage, it was that he couldn't bear to choose. Anne, blunt and unapologetic, followed shortly after with her own private audience. Her words, sources claim, cut deeper than William's. "You're not protecting your wife," she said. "You're abandoning the monarchy." It wasn't rage that moved her, it was disappointment. By the end of that week, Charles had vanished to Balmoral. Officially, it was rest. Unofficially, it was retreat. Staff reported a king who walked the grounds alone, avoided all but necessary contact, and requested no briefing document. The palace went quiet. Decisions hung in the air, and in that silence Camilla grew restless. According to intercepted correspondences between the king and queen consort, Charles wrote a line that revealed the depth of his inner conflict. "They're coming for you, and I don't know how to stop it." That single sentence, raw and terrified, showed a man no longer leading but bracing for impact. And yet, even in that quiet desperation, Charles understood the storm was no longer avoidable. In a final conversation before returning to London, he admitted to William what no one expected to hear. "I've made a mess of everything," he said, his voice reportedly cracking under the weight of guilt. It wasn't a statement of defeat, it was the first true acknowledgement of failure. But admission without action was no longer enough. The monarchy needed movement. And Charles, broken between past and present, had run out of time to delay the inevitable. But before Charles could act, Camilla made a move. No one anticipated a preemptive strike designed to protect her legacy at all costs. Faced with the threat of losing her grip on the crown, Camilla didn't retreat, she retaliated. From backroom deals to sudden staff changes, she attempted to secure her place. But one misstep would become her undoing, turning allies into enemies and igniting a palace rebellion she couldn't control. Camilla had always been strategic, but now her moves were brazen. The discovery of the Queen's clause sent a chill through her inner circle, and instead of softening her approach, she doubled down. Behind closed doors, she summoned senior palace aides, including key figures in press communications, and launched a quiet counter-offensive. Messages were passed through intermediaries, agendas rewritten, and a list of priorities emerged. Camilla was to be centered, re-elevated, and insulated at all costs. Trusted staff members loyal to Catherine or Anne were suddenly reassigned or dismissed entirely. Roles that had taken years to build vanished in days. Loyalty was no longer enough. Alignment with Camilla was now the price of survival. The changes were immediate. Upcoming royal engagements were revised to feature Camilla more prominently, her name first. Her speeches longer, her image reshaped. Behind the scenes, she was pushing for enhanced ceremonial responsibilities and a bolder public-facing role. It wasn't about symbolism anymore, it was about dominance. But that ambition came at a cost. Staff morale plummeted, rumors of silencing tactics began to circulate, and whispers turned into open defiance when a leaked audio recording emerged. Camilla, caught in a moment of fury, reportedly telling a senior advisor, "I made this family acceptable again. They owe me everything." The statement wasn't just arrogant, it was incendiary. The backlash was swift and brutal. During a high-profile charity appearance that was meant to reinforce her public image, Camilla was met not with admiration but with pointed questions and critical headlines. Critics labeled the event self-serving, out of touch, even manipulative. Social media exploded with speculation. The carefully crafted narrative of the supportive queen consort was unraveling in real time, replaced by a darker picture of calculation and self-preservation. Inside the palace, the mood shifted. Advisors who had once stood by her began distancing themselves. And then came the final blow. A senior aide, one who had worked under both Elizabeth and Charles, quietly resigned. No fanfare, no press release, just a letter of resignation, followed by a private meeting with Prince William. What was shared in that room remains sealed. but palace insiders confirmed the aide handed over internal documents, emails, meeting notes, and briefing memos that painted a disturbing picture of Camilla's campaign. For William, it was the confirmation he needed. This wasn't misjudgment. This was a coordinated attempt to overwrite the very legacy his mother had protected and his grandmother had enshrined. The palace was no longer safe ground, and William knew the time had come to do what once seemed unthinkable: take control. With allies in place and truths exposed, William and Anne moved with surgical precision. In a storm of press, internal directives, and private meetings, they orchestrated a reset of royal hierarchy. Camilla would not be erased, but her power would be. And the crown, they insisted, would belong to the people again. The first strike came behind closed doors. William convened an emergency session with the Privy Council, flanked not by Charles but by Anne, whose presence made the message clear: this was no longer a consultation. It was an intervention. With documentation in hand, including Queen Elizabeth's suppressed clause and the newly surfaced advisor correspondence, William laid out a case not built on bitterness, but on betrayal. The monarchy, he argued, had drifted from its foundation. The future had been hijacked by influence, not legacy, and it was time to put it right. That same evening, Anne handed Charles a sealed letter, its tone neither pleading nor deferential. It was an ultimatum. Sources close to the palace say the letter laid out a path forward: step back or risk a public unravelling. There would be no scandal if Charles agreed to restructure Camilla's role, no humiliation, just a quiet redistribution of authority. But if he resisted, the royal family would find itself at war with its own heirs. And in this chess match, it was already too late to reclaim the board. Within 72 hours, changes began appearing in palace communications. Catherine, who had been subtly pushed into the shadows, returned to centre stage. Public briefings now referenced her as the future of the monarchy, a deliberate echo of Queen Elizabeth's language. Photos of Camilla disappeared from upcoming ceremonial agendas, while new talking points emphasized stability, continuity, and tradition under William and Catherine's leadership. The message was subtle but unmistakable. A transition was no longer speculative. It was in motion. Internally, the reshuffle gained momentum. Camilla's ceremonial responsibilities, once expansive, were quietly reassigned. Anne assumed oversight of state protocol duties, while Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, was granted patronages that had previously been absorbed into Camilla's portfolio. The changes were not announced. They simply happened. What once had been Camilla's realm of influence was now being managed by women the crown saw as protectors of continuity, not disruptors of it. Then came the footage, leaked but clearly intentional. A clip showing William and Anne in a closed-door meeting, reviewing the upcoming coronation planning documents. Camilla was not in the room. The optics were devastating. The power dynamic, once favouring the Queen consort, had shifted unmistakably. The video spread across global media within hours. It wasn't just a story, it was a message. And finally, an internal staff directive sealed what insiders called the quiet coup. Camilla's office, it read, would now fall under strategic oversight, a bureaucratic term masking a brutal reality. She had lost autonomy. Every move, every message, every engagement would now pass through a filter she didn't control. The Queen consort remained in title, but the machinery of her power had been stripped away piece by piece. But the storm had not passed. As the dust settled, the world watched for Camilla's response, and she didn't stay silent for long. For days she vanished. Then, just as speculation reached a fever pitch, Camilla re-emerged. Her statement, handwritten and raw, sent a new shock through the monarchy. But was it an apology or a warning? What she said and didn't say may hold the key to what happens next. The silence had become deafening. As the palace restructured and William and Anne seized control of the narrative, Camilla disappeared entirely from the public eye. No appearances, no photographs, not even a whisper from her notoriously tight-knit communications team. The vacuum was quickly filled by speculation. Was she preparing for exile? Had Charles forced her into retreat? Or worse, was an abdication quietly being negotiated behind closed doors? The press circled like vultures, but the palace gave nothing. And then, just as it seemed the Queen consort had been completely erased, a white envelope arrived on the desks of every major news outlet in the company. Untry. It bore no seal, only her name. Inside was a handwritten letter, signed in her distinctive cursive. It began with an unexpected tone, not defiance, but vulnerability. Camilla acknowledged the pain her decisions may have caused, and admitted that her actions had been misunderstood, guided, she claimed, by loyalty to the monarchy, not personal ambition. She did not name names. She did not defend herself in detail. Instead, she chose ambiguity, an emotional tightrope that walked between confession and confrontation. One line stood out above all: "Truth has many heirs, but only one crown." It was a subtle, unmistakable challenge to William's moral narrative. She was not going quietly, she was not surrendering, she was reframing. Her most intimate words, however, were reserved for Charles. "You are my strength in this storm," she wrote. It was a plea cloaked in devotion, a message not to the public but to the one man whose silence had cut deepest. In those few words, Camilla laid bare the emotional collapse behind palace walls. The power struggle hadn't just fractured the monarchy, it had fractured a marriage. Whether she meant to appeal to his heart or his throne, the effect was the same: it reopened wounds no strategy could fully conceal. The public reaction was instantaneous and polarizing. Some sympathized, seeing in her words the humanity that had long been buried beneath titles and protocol. Others were outraged, accusing her of emotional manipulation and veiled threats. But regardless of sentiment, the letter worked its magic. It returned Camilla to the spotlight, not as a victor, but as a woman surrounded by fire and refusing to burn. But while Camilla spoke to the world, it was William who took the final step, one that sealed her new role and confirmed the crown's shifting power. In an unprecedented turn, Buckingham Palace updated its official site. The title Queen Consort remained, but beneath it, new language appeared: honorary ceremonial role, non-political. Camilla was no longer a decision-maker, and in that moment, the monarchy declared its future, with William and Anne standing as guardians of legacy, not sentiment. The move came quietly but thundered across the nation like a drumbeat of finality. With a single digital update, the crown drew a bold line between tradition and transition. Camilla's once influential advisory role had been recast. No more policy input, no more council privileges. She would remain by Charles's side during public events, but as a symbol and escort to the throne, not a shaper of its direction. The term Queen Consort stayed intact, but it had been hollowed out, reduced to its ceremonial skeleton. Power, once fluid and quietly accumulated, had now been codified and constrained. Simultaneously, the palace released a new internal charter, outlining the redistribution of core responsibilities. Catherine was formally granted oversight of royal diplomatic affairs and future queen training initiatives, a clear signal that her rise was no longer implied, but enacted. She would serve not as a figurehead, but as a force, public-facing, policy-prepared, and institutionally empowered. It was a move designed not only to elevate Catherine, but to stabilize the monarchy's image in the eyes of a generation desperate for clarity. Anne's role was also expanded, this time with sweeping control over military patronages and royal charitable governance. She would act as the moral backbone of the firm, ensuring continuity with the Queen's legacy and enforcing the values of duty, discretion, and dignity. It was Anne's unwavering loyalty to the institution that had helped expose the fault lines, and now she was being entrusted to guard them from future erosion. But the most deafening message came through absence. As the formal statement was released, Charles was nowhere to be seen. No photograph, no signature. Sources inside the palace confirmed what many had suspected: he had declined to appear, citing the emotional toll of recent months. Some said he had wept during a private meeting with his personal secretary. Others claimed he had refused to sign the final edits until the very last moment. Regardless of the truth, one thing was undeniable: his silence echoed louder than any speech could have. And as the IC absorbed the news, sentiment shifted like a tidal wave. Polls surged in favor of William and Anne. Approval ratings for Catherine reached record highs. Even Republic-leaning voices paused, if only momentarily, to admit that something rare had happened: a royal course correction. Not reactive, not scandal-driven, but strategic, calculated, symbolic. The monarchy had not just survived the storm, it had redefined itself within it. The crown has spoken, but peace rarely lasts in the palace. Behind closed doors, new tensions brew, because when power shifts once, it can shift again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.